The biting wind of the high plains whipped through Redemption Gulch, carrying dust that stung the eyes and settled in a fine grit on everything. For Silas, it was just another part of the day. He pulled the collar of his worn sheepskin coat tighter, his gaze fixed on the swinging doors of the gilded Spur Saloon. It wasn't a place of comfort for a man with pockets as empty as his, but the chill was seeping into his bones, and the thought of a single, cheap whiskey was a siren's call. At his heel, a scrawny mutt of indeterminate heritage shivered, its thin coat offering little protection. Silas had found him a few months back, half-starved behind a livery stable. He'd named him Dusty, for the color of his fur and the land that had birthed them both. The dog's ribs were a roadmap of hardship, but his tail gave a hopeful thump against Silas's leg. Silas reached down, his rough, calloused hand scratching the dog behind the ears. "Stay here, boy. Won't be long," he murmured, his voice a low rasp. He looped a frayed piece of rope around a hitching post and gave Dusty one last reassuring pat before pushing through the saloon doors. The sudden warmth was a relief, thick with the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and unwashed men. The place was moderately full. A few prospectors argued over a card game, a blacksmith nursed a beer at the bar, and in the corner, holding court, was Bart Barlow. Barlow was a man who'd found fortune in cattle, and he wore his success like a badge, loud and arrogant. His laughter boomed across the room, demanding attention. Silas ignored him, making his way to the far end of the bar. He laid 2 coins on the polished wood. "Whiskey," he said, not meeting the bartender's indifferent gaze. He took the glass and retreated to a shadowy corner, hoping to remain invisible. From his spot, he could see Dusty through the grimy window, curled into a tight ball against the post, trying to conserve warmth. A sudden roar of laughter from Barlow's table broke the saloon's low drone. Silas looked over. Barlow was pointing a thick finger toward the window. "Well, look what the wind blew in, or what it couldn't be bothered to blow away," he bellowed. "Silas, is that your prize-winning hound out there? I've seen more meat on a butcher's hook." The men at his table howled. Another man chimed in, "He ain't a dog, Bart, he's a walking skeleton. You could use his ribs as a washboard." Heat crawled up Silas's neck, a familiar burn of shame and anger. He kept his eyes fixed on his glass, swirling the amber liquid. He was used to the jibes about his worn-out clothes and his lack of coin, but the mockery of his dog felt different. It felt personal. Dusty was the only creature in this world that didn't judge him, that offered loyalty without asking for anything in return. "A man's character can be judged by the dog he keeps," Barlow declared, his voice dripping with condescension. "And that one looks like it's one stray meal away from turning into dust itself, just like its owner." The insult hung in the air, heavy and sharp. The laughter died down to snickers as all eyes turned to Silas. He could feel their stares, a physical weight pressing down on him. He slowly raised his head, his gaze meeting Barlow's across the smoky room. There was no fire in his eyes, only a deep, weary sadness. He downed the rest of his whiskey in one gulp, the cheap liquor burning a trail down his throat. Without a word, he placed the empty glass on the table, turned his back on the silent, watching crowd, and pushed his way out into the unforgiving cold. The frigid wind cut through the cracks of the abandoned line shack that Silas and Dusty called home. It was little more than 4 decaying walls and a patchy roof, situated a hard mile from the mocking lights of Redemption Gulch. The humiliation from the saloon still clung to Silas like the cold, a bitter weight in his chest. He sat on a threadbare bedroll, splitting his last piece of hardtack with Dusty, who devoured his portion gratefully. The dog, sensing his master's gloom, rested his bony head on Silas's knee, his warm brown eyes offering a silent comfort that no human had ever extended. "Just you and me, boy," Silas murmured, stroking the dog's matted fur. "That's all we need." He wasn't a man for anger. Life had beaten that out of him long ago. What he felt was a deep, familiar weariness. Barlow's words, sharpened by the laughter of the crowd, weren't just about a skinny dog. They were a judgment on his entire existence, his worn-out boots, his patched-up coat, his empty pockets. To them, he was as disposable as a stray dog. But looking at Dusty, Silas knew they were wrong. Loyalty like this wasn't something you could buy. The next morning, a biting frost covered the sparse landscape. Silas needed to trade the few pelts he'd managed to trap for flour and beans. In town, the atmosphere was different. There was a nervous energy buzzing beneath the usual bustle. At the general store, he overheard two prospectors talking in hushed, urgent tones. "The Red Scorpions," one said, his voice low, "hit the mining camp at Silver Creek. Didn't leave a soul standing that fought back." The store owner, a portly man named Henderson, polished the counter with a worried frown. "Sheriff says they wouldn't dare come this far south. Says Mr. Barlow's got enough hired guns to start his own army." Silas listened quietly, his gaze drifting out the window towards the gilded spur. He could imagine the scene inside perfectly. Later that day, as he passed by, the saloon doors swung open, spilling a wave of boisterous laughter onto the street. Bart Barlow stood at the center of a group, a cigarillo perched in the corner of his mouth. "Let those scorpions come," Barlow boomed, his voice thick with arrogance. "We'll give 'em a welcome they won't soon forget. Maybe we'll post that drifter's pathetic mutt out front as a warning." Another round of cruel laughter followed. Silas flinched but kept walking, pulling the collar of his coat tighter. He knew this land. He knew how isolated Redemption Gulch was, how the rocky canyons and sparse plains made for perfect ambush country. The town's confidence was a thin veneer, built on the wealth of one arrogant man. They saw the world through the bottom of a whiskey glass, secure in their numbers and their noise. They didn't see the silent threats that gathered in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the lamplight. That night, as a coyote howled in the distance, Silas didn't just feel the cold of the coming night. He felt the chill of a gathering storm that the town was determined to ignore. From the rocky ridge overlooking Redemption Gulch, the town looked like a collection of children's blocks scattered in the dust. A man with a scar splitting his left eyebrow lowered a brass spyglass, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. He passed it to his companion, a hulk of a man whose silence was more menacing than any threat. "Look at him, Hector," the scarred man rasped, his voice like grinding stones. "Fat cows waiting for the slaughter, especially that saloon. Lights blazing every night, no discipline, no fear," Hector grunted, peering through the lens at the gilded spur. He watched men stumbling in and out, their laughter carrying faintly on the wind. They were soft, predictable, an easy score. Down below, Silas felt eyes on his back. He was a few miles from town, checking a line of snares he'd set for rabbits, with Dusty trotting a few paces ahead. The feeling was a familiar one for a man who lived on the edges, a prickling sensation at the nape of his neck that signaled he was being watched. He paused, scanning the high ridges that cupped the valley. For a moment, a glint of sunlight flashed off something metallic high up on the rocks. It was there and then gone, too quick to be a natural reflection. Dusty stopped, his ears perked, and a low, almost inaudible growl rumbled in his chest. He wasn't looking at the ridge but at the trail ahead, his nose twitching. Silas quieted him with a soft hand on his scruffy neck. "Easy, boy, I see it too." The next afternoon, a lone rider galloped into town, his horse lathered and his face pale with panic. He reined in sharply in front of the sheriff's office, nearly falling from the saddle. Sheriff Brody, a man whose gut strained the buttons of his vest, emerged slowly, picking at his teeth with a splinter of wood. "What's all the commotion, son?" he asked, his tone heavy with annoyance. "It's my partner, Jed," the rider gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "He was a day behind me on the trail from Willow Creek. His horse, we just found it wandering near Coyote Pass. Saddlebags were cut open, and there's no sign of him." A small crowd gathered, murmuring with concern. Bart Barlow, stepping out of the mercantile, scoffed loudly. "Probably got spooked by a snake and ran off. Some men ain't cut out for the trail." Sheriff Brody nodded in agreement, eager to quell the rising panic. "Now, calm yourself. Jed probably got lost after his horse bolted. I'll send Deputy Miller out to have a look in the morning. No sense getting worked up over a man losing his way." He clapped the rider on the shoulder with a dismissive finality and turned to go back inside his office, the matter already forgotten. Silas had been standing in the shadows of the blacksmith's forge, listening to the entire exchange. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Coyote Pass was in the same direction as the glint he'd seen from the ridge. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this wasn't an accident. The Red Scorpions were no longer a rumor. They were here, testing the waters, picking off the weak. As the crowd dispersed, placated by the sheriff's hollow assurances, Silas met Dusty's intelligent gaze. The dog whined softly, pressing against his leg. They were alone in their knowledge, two silent sentinels watching a town that was willingly blindfolding itself as the wolves circled closer. The night air in Redemption Gulch grew cool, but inside the Gilded Spur Saloon, the atmosphere was thick with bravado and whiskey fumes. Laughter echoed off the wooden walls as Bart Barlow, his face flushed with drink, slammed his mug on the bar. "To the Red Scorpions," he bellowed, a mocking grin spreading across his face. "May they have the good sense to stay clear of a town with real men in it." The crowd roared in approval. Sheriff Brody, leaning against the bar with a lazy confidence, simply chuckled and shook his head. "They're just ghost stories, Bart, meant to scare travelers. No bandit with half a brain would dare come near this town." His words were meant to be reassuring, but they dripped with the same arrogance that had festered in the town for years. Outside, miles away from the saloon's boisterous ignorance, Silas sat by a small, crackling fire. The vast desert sky, studded with 1,000,000 indifferent stars, stretched above him. Dusty lay at his feet, not sleeping, but unnaturally still. His head was raised, his ears twitching, pointed toward the dark ridges that flanked the town. Silas placed a hand on his dog's back, feeling the tension in his wiry frame. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Dusty didn't respond with a reassuring lick or a wag of his tail. Instead, a low, guttural growl rumbled deep in his chest. It was a sound Silas had never heard from him before, not of aggression, but of profound alarm. He stood up, his eyes scanning the darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but the chirping of crickets and the whisper of the wind. Then he heard it, the faint, rhythmic clatter of shod hooves on stone, too many to be a lone rider. His blood ran cold. He quickly extinguished the fire, plunging their camp into darkness. Grabbing his worn Winchester rifle, he crept to a rocky outcrop that gave him a clear, albeit distant, view of the town's main street. The attack came with the sudden violence of a lightning strike. One moment, the saloon was an island of defiant light and noise. The next, it was under siege. Dark figures on horseback materialized from the shadows, converging on the Gilded Spur. The swing doors burst inward with a splintering crash. The joyous laughter was cut short, replaced by a single, sharp gunshot, followed by a torrent of panic screams. From his vantage point, Silas watched in horror. The men who had been so full of bluster only moments ago were now scrambling for cover like frightened rats. He saw a figure, likely Barlow, shoved roughly to the floor. The confident swagger of Sheriff Brody was gone, replaced by the frantic movements of a man utterly out of his depth. More shots rang out, muzzle flashes illuminating the chaos within. The Red Scorpions were not just robbing the place. They were brutalizing it, fueled by a cruel contempt for the town's perceived strength. Silas's heart pounded against his ribs. These were the men who had mocked him, who had laughed at his poverty and scorned his only friend. A part of him, a bitter, wounded part, wanted to turn away and let them suffer the fate their arrogance had invited. But as he heard another scream cut through the night, he looked down at Dusty. The dog was looking up at him, not with fear, but with a fierce, unwavering loyalty. In that moment, Silas knew he couldn't leave. He and his scruffy, underestimated dog were the only ones who knew the bandits were coming, the only ones prepared. The town's fate, and the lives of the very people who had cast him out, now rested on his shoulders. The sun over the Arizona territory was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked earth and bleaching the life from anything that wasn't tough enough to endure it. For Silas, that hammer felt personal. Every line on his face, etched deep by sun and worry, told a story of hardship. He rode not on a horse, but on his own 2 worn-out leather boots, his worldly possessions limited to what he could carry in a dusty rucksack. At his side, trotting with a quiet resilience that mirrored his own, was Dusty, a dog whose ribs showed a little too clearly beneath a coat the color of the parched ground. They were 2 solitary figures against a vast, indifferent landscape, bound by a companionship that needed no words. They had spent the last 3 weeks chasing a rumor of gold flecks in a dry creek bed miles from anywhere, a rumor that turned out to be as empty as Silas's stomach. Now, trudging toward the ramshackle collection of buildings known as Redemption Gulch, their only goal was a bit of shade and maybe, if fortune finally smiled, a paid meal. Dusty nudged his hand with a wet nose, a silent question. Silas reached down and scratched the dog behind the ears, his calloused fingers gentle. "Almost there, boy," he murmured, his voice raspy from thirst. "We'll find something." Redemption Gulch offered little in the way of redemption. It was a town built on desperation and fleeting luck, where cattle barons and gamblers held court while men like Silas clung to the fringes. As they entered the main thoroughfare, the contrast was stark. Men in fine hats and tailored coats stepped out of the Gilded Spur Saloon, their laughter loud and dismissive. A gleaming carriage, pulled by 2 magnificent black horses, rumbled past its owner, the formidable rancher Bart Barlow, barely glancing at the man and dog he forced into the dusty gutter. Barlow, a man whose wealth was as vast as his cruelty, represented everything Silas was not: powerful, respected, and comfortable. Silas felt the familiar sting of invisibility, of being less than the dust kicked up by a rich man's horse. He watched Barlow dismount and stride into the saloon, the swing doors closing behind him like the gates to another world. A world of warmth, whiskey, and camaraderie, things Silas hadn't known in a long time. His gaze lingered on the building. He had a few coins left, painstakingly saved. It was enough for a single glass of whiskey, enough to wash away the trail dust, and for a few precious moments, the bitterness of another failure. It was a foolish impulse. The money could buy a small loaf of bread that would last 2 days. But the thirst was a physical ache, and the loneliness was a deeper one. He looked at Dusty, who sat patiently, his brown eyes fixed on Silas, trusting him completely. "You wait here, boy," Silas said, his voice low. "I won't be long." He gave the dog one last pat, squared his slumped shoulders, and pushed his way through the swinging doors of the Gilded Spur, leaving the only loyal soul he knew outside in the encroaching chill of the evening. Panic was a wild animal, and it was loose inside the Gilded Spur. Silas saw it from the ridge, 100 yards away, in the frantic, jerky movements of the shadows inside. A gunshot cracked the night air, followed by a woman's scream that was cut short. His jaw tightened. He wasn't a hero, and he had no illusions about facing down a dozen armed men. A direct fight was a fool's death, but retreat felt like a betrayal, not of the people who scorned him, but of himself. He looked down at Dusty, whose body was coiled like a spring, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The dog's eyes were fixed on the saloon, waiting for a command. In that moment, Silas saw not a scrawny mutt, but a weapon, fast, intelligent, and utterly loyal. An idea, sharp and dangerous, began to form. It was a plan born of poverty, a strategy only a man who knew the town's forgotten spaces could conceive. "Easy, boy," Silas whispered, his voice a dry rasp. He mapped it out in his mind. The main street was a kill zone, but the alley behind the saloon, that was different. It was narrow, choked with discarded crates and barrels, a place the wealthy patrons never saw. More importantly, it was where the bandits had carelessly tethered their horses. Their confidence was their weakness. They believed the town was theirs for the taking. They wouldn't have posted a dedicated guard on their mounts. "Listen to me, Dusty," Silas murmured, crouching to look the dog in the eye. He pointed a long, calloused finger toward the front of the saloon, where the light spilled out onto the dusty street. "You go there, stay in the shadows, bark, make them think someone's common from the street, but you don't get close. You hear me, just make noise, be fast. When I whistle, you run back here, fast as you can." Dusty gave a soft whine, a sign of understanding. He licked Silas's hand once, a silent promise. With another quiet command, the dog detached from his side and became a flicker of gray shadow, streaking through the sagebrush toward the edge of town. Silas didn't wait to watch. He moved in the opposite direction, his worn boots making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He circled wide, using the cover of the blacksmith's workshop and the general store to approach the alley from the south. The air grew thick with the smell of stale beer and horse manure. He could hear the bandits' gruff laughter and the terrified sobs of the captives inside. Peeking around the corner, he saw them, 10 horses, tied loosely to a long hitching rail. Just as he'd gambled, there was no one watching them. A few moments later, a series of sharp, frantic barks erupted from the front of the saloon, Dusty's diversion. "What the hell was that?" a voice bellowed from inside. The swing doors flew open, and 2 bandits stepped out, rifles raised, peering into the darkness of the main street. "Go check it out. Probably just a stray," that was his chance. Silas slipped into the alley, his heart hammering against his ribs. He pulled out his small, worn-out skinning knife. He didn't have time to untie the knots. He moved to the lead horse, a big roan, and sawed through its leather reins. The horse tossed its head, eyes rolling. He moved to the next one, and the next, his hands a blur of motion. He severed the last rein just as one of the bandits shouted from the front, "It's just a damn dog." They were turning back. Silas had only seconds. He took a deep breath, put 2 fingers to his lips, and let out a piercingly sharp whistle, the signal for Dusty. Then, he grabbed a loose piece of timber from a woodpile and slammed it hard against the roan's flank. The horse screamed in surprise and pain, rearing up. Its panic was contagious. In a thunderous explosion of hooves and whinnies, the entire string of horses broke free, stampeding down the narrow alley and out into the open desert. Their escape was gone. The sun broke over the dusty horizon, its pale light filtering through the saloon's shattered windows to illuminate a scene of quiet devastation. The remaining red scorpions, leaderless and demoralized, had surrendered without their horses, their bravado evaporating as quickly as the morning mist. Sheriff Brody, his face a mixture of exhaustion and shame, was busy securing the last of the bandits with ropes provided by the very patrons he'd failed to protect. But the town's eyes weren't on the captured outlaws or the weary lawman. They were on Silas, who stood quietly near the entrance, Dusty sitting faithfully at his side. Bart Barlow, his fine clothes smudged with dirt and whiskey, finally stumbled out. He saw Silas and flinched, the arrogance in his eyes replaced by a raw, humbling fear. He remembered cowering behind the bar while Silas's plan unfolded. He remembered the cowboy's calm resolve in the face of chaos. The whole town had witnessed it. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he say? An apology felt hollow, a thank you insufficient. It was the blacksmith, a burly man named Gus, who broke the silence. He walked over to Silas, his hand extended. "We owe you our lives," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And your dog, too." One by one, others followed. The store owner, the ranch hands who had once laughed at him, even the saloon girls. They offered thanks, apologies, and handshakes. Silas, unaccustomed to such attention, simply nodded, his hand resting on Dusty's head. He hadn't acted for their approval, but for what was right. Yet, a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he hadn't realized he'd been missing. Sheriff Brody approached last, his badge seeming to weigh heavily on his chest. "Silas," he began, his voice raspy. "I was a fool, proud and blind. I misjudged you, and I almost cost this town everything. What you did tonight, that was real law-keeping. Cunning, brave. I'd be honored if you'd consider being my deputy. Redemption Gulch needs a man like you." Silas looked from the sheriff to the townspeople, then down at Dusty, who licked his hand as if sensing the gravity of the moment. For years, they had been ghosts, existing on the fringes. Now, they were being offered a place to belong. He thought of the cold nights and empty bellies, of the loneliness that was as biting as the desert wind. He met the sheriff's gaze. "We'll do it," he said, his voice quiet but firm. A cheer went up from the small crowd. Later that evening, the Gilded Spur Saloon was abuzz, not with fear, but with celebration. The broken furniture had been cleared away, and the lanterns cast a hopeful glow. At the main table, a place of honor was set. Silas sat there, a full plate of food in front of him. At his feet, Dusty wasn't gnawing on a discarded bone, but feasting on a thick, juicy steak the bartender had cooked just for him. Bart Barlow watched from a corner, nursing a drink in solitude, a man stripped of his influence. No one paid him any mind. Their respect and their gratitude was now focused on the quiet cowboy and his scrawny, heroic dog.